But I'm going to go back a bit and say a little bit about why on earth I, as a social anthropologist, ever decided to write this book, Decoding Chomsky. And I mean, 30 years ago, I just wouldn't have believed that Chris Knight would end up getting involved in this kind of thing. I mean, what on earth am I doing, delving into all these strange details about what did or didn't happen at MIT in the 50s and 60s? So just a bit of background, as some of you may know. My first book, Blood Relations, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture, was an attempt to explain the transition from a primate social system and cognitive system to humanity, to human life, to human symbolic culture, ritual, kinship, and so forth. And in that book, there was something left out. Because, as everyone would, I'm sure, agree, what makes us special, what makes our species so strange and special is, of course, the complexity of our communication system, language. Non-human primates are very clever, they have very subtle communication systems, cognitively very sophisticated, but a chimpanzee in its vocal communication doesn't have an ounce, not an ounce, of grammar. And the same applies to any other primate communication system. Whereas, of course, with humans, a child seems to be equipped from birth to master what must be the most complex theoretical structure that we're aware of. The grammar of a language is immensely complex, and no linguist has ever succeeded in really working out what the grammar of any language is. And yet a child takes to it, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, as if it kind of knew the basics already. So everything else about evolution, you can sort of have a Darwinian approach. You can say that other instincts that we humans have got, sex, well, animals do that. Aggression, animals seem to have those instincts. Maternity, you can see precursors of all the other basic instincts that humans have in non-human primates. When it comes to language, assuming you agree that language is a kind of instinct, and I think the capacity to learn a language is clearly biological. And as I said, children have an urge to learn language. You can call it a language instinct, and to me there's nothing wrong with that. That's pretty convincing. That all of that makes language a puzzle. And not just a puzzle, it's actually a theoretical challenge to the entire Darwinian paradigm. I think there's a solution to it, but it's challenging. Anyway, in my book, Blood Relations, there was just a big hole because I didn't address that topic, hardly addressed it. And the reason was because every time I tried to mug up a bit on linguistics, I turned to Noam Chomsky, and I just couldn't get my head around it. And of course, at first I thought, well, it's probably my fault. I probably could get my head around a lot of modern nuclear physics because I'm not trained, and I need to try harder, and I need to try harder, and I need to try harder. So I tried and tried and tried, and it didn't work. So anyway, I published my book, Blood Relations, and then aware really that I needed help, I decided, instead of writing another book with language in it, all on my own, I'd convene a conference to get as many people as I could, bring them together and see whether collectively we could sort things out. So I linked up with Professor Jim Herford of the Linguistics Department at Edinburgh. And at UEL we had a preliminary meeting, University of East London, small meeting, and at that small meeting we decided to have a much bigger kind of international meeting of EvoLang, the Evolution of Language series of conferences, and we held our first event in 1996. And since then, EvoLang has been I would say, the main forum for people who are interested in this puzzle, the origin of language. It's been the main forum for them, and every 2 years we've had a conference, and you can see at the back there quite a few books have come out of it. I've edited quite a few of them. And now let me just explain why increasingly I got more than frustrated. It's just that within the community of linguists, again and again and again, I found that although they didn't all agree with Noam Chomsky, some disagreed quite strongly, some disagreed not so much, some were somewhere in the middle, some were very strongly on Noam's side. It's like Noam Chomsky was the kind of the gold standard, the measure. You were close to him, a bit further away, but Chomsky was always where you measured yourself from. And from where I was coming with my background, I just kept finding that, I don't know, well, we had our first meeting in Edinburgh about the origins of language, and what was just obvious was that we didn't have a language in common. You know, there was no way we could communicate, because even say, for example, the concept language, we didn't share it at all. Because for me, language is, for example, it's about communication. It's a system for communicating thoughts, ideas, dreams. Chomsky says language isn't that at all. He says, for example, your legs, you can say things with your legs, okay? Because your gait, the gait you choose to adopt, can send a message. Your hair, the hairstyle you're wearing, you can convey a message with that. And he says that language is no more designed for communicating thoughts than your hair or your legs. And in fact, language is for talking to yourself. It's for thinking. Not really talking to yourself, because of course if you're talking to yourself, you're probably doing it in French or English or Swahili or whatever language is yours. But he doesn't want to talk about it. He says language is an internal system of communication with yourself or computational thinking that you're not even aware of. But fundamentally, it's not social. So to me, I don't know. I just thought, well, where do I begin? There's just no way of meeting. And I got more and more, I suppose, inside myself, actually quite angry with this whole position. And at the same time, I thought, who am I to sort of stand up to this gigantic figure that, who almost represents modern linguistics? And of course, I'm on the left. I kept thinking, how can he get angry with Noam? I mean, Noam, he's extraordinary. He speaks the truth. He speaks truth to power more effectively than anyone else. His expose of corruption, lies, crime around the world perpetrated by his own government, I mean, they're second to none. No one else seems to have the ability and the courage and the clarity to be able to send out messages in the way that Noam does. So it was difficult. But if I could just explain, perhaps just with a few examples, why I wasn't just concerned and frustrated, but actually more and more, I mean, angry is possibly not the right word, but people keep telling me, Chris, you sound so angry, so I need to address that and explain it. Noam insists that the study of language can only be a branch of natural science. It's like mathematics or physics, not social science. Well, I'm a social anthropologist, and to me, we humans are socially unique, socially distinct, and language must be a part of being different in social terms. I've got no objection, of course, to adopting a natural science approach to language. There's all kinds of aspects of language which you can approach within a natural science paradigm. But if you're talking about how and when did language evolve in the species, to my mind, you have to include the social aspects. And if you simply say language is a natural object and it is not a social instinct or a social process or a social object, I don't know how to cope with that. So, okay, how can you say that concepts are natural, part of the human genome? Well, the philosopher Hilary Putnam a few years ago asked Noam that. He said, well, this is Putnam, Noam, are you saying house is an innate concept inscribed in the human genome? So Noam said, yes. So Putnam said, well, all right, what about book? So the question was the concept book. Did humans at the moment of the emergence of Homo sapiens, did humans when we were hunter-gatherers and didn't have any books, did they all humans have the concept book in their head? Noam said, yes.
This is exactly like Plato.
And then, so Hilary Putnam thought, okay, I've got to try something. Surely he won't say yes to this one. Carburettor. No, you can't be saying that carburettor is an innate concept. I can quote you if you like from his, his actual words. He came back, no. If you look at it carefully, there can be no other explanation than that carburettor is innate. It's installed in all of us genetically. I hope you can sort of see a kind of exasperation. What do you do about this? I mean, how can you kind of even begin to cope with a position like that? Now, as some of you again may know, my early work, my book Blood Relations, is about the transition to human symbolic culture, and I felt very happy, and still do, that in many ways that problem has been kind of solved. I'm very happy with what I did, and especially recently with colleagues building on that work. Now, my argument has always been that Darwinism can be gradual, but when you're dealing with social and political and cultural topics, a gradual Darwinian process can accelerate, and it can accelerate and accelerate until evolution becomes revolution. You get a tipping point, you get a rapid change and a change of quality, not just quantity. And so I've always based myself on this concept of a human revolution. And I've always thought that everything distinctively human about our nature, our capacity to see ourselves as others see us, each of us can do that. It's a unique capacity. Chimpanzees never really see themselves as if from the outside. They don't really put themselves in others' shoes. They have empathy and things, but they don't quite get to the point of egocentric perspective reversal. It's a way of putting what we humans are capable of doing. We can establish rules, moral rules of behavior. It's often difficult, but in general we do have the capacity to establish rules and stick to them. And of course we have language. Now my view is that all these uniquely human features are actually the products of the greatest revolution in history, the revolution that worked. And my argument is that here we are, we've got these capacities, and we know that revolution worked. Most other revolutions kind of didn't work, but this one certainly did, because here we are with all these things which make us who we are, make us human, and not, we are primates, but we're very strange and unusual ones. Okay, how could you make the human revolution this most significant, in many ways, certainly for us, but even apart from our subjectivity, the transition from a primate to humans, even just looking objectively at the history of life on Earth, this extraordinary transition, how can you make that a natural science development, not a social one, and devoid of human significance? In other words, how can you make the most exciting, the most extraordinary revolution in history utterly irrelevant and meaningless? Well, I know. You could say that what happened was that there was a random mutation. You might say that some ape was wandering around and it was hit by a cosmic ray shower. And as a result of that, the cosmic rays triggered a mutation in that creature's head, and it installed suddenly, from nowhere, without any precursor, a fully functioning language organ, whereupon that creature started talking to itself. Now again, I mean, I was in Evolang. We were discussing the evolutionary emergence of language, and that theory was taken, I won't say everyone agrees with it, but you would be surprised how many archaeologists in the 80s thought that was a fairly good theory to explain this relatively sudden emergence of Homo sapiens, the extinction of the Neanderthals. Maybe they didn't have the right organ installed by a mutation coming from a cosmic ray shower in their brains. And once the organ is there, of course you're going to get art and culture and ritual and all these amazing things that make us human. And to me, I don't know, just the idea that is an explanation, it's not that it's wrong, it doesn't even qualify as an explanation, that a mutation comes from nowhere and produces this organ in the head. But, as I say, that was the assumption that Chomsky was putting forward, and Paul Mellers and many other people were actually thinking, well, that's the best theory we've come across. some of them said quite nice things about my book, but my book's deeply worrying, you know, because it's about sex and females and menstruation, all kinds of stuff which, you know, it doesn't really fit into a purely natural science paradigm. So, okay, now, because I felt more and more frustrated, I thought I've got to delve into this. And why don't I do what a social anthropologist would do? Okay, so just to explain this bit. If you're a social anthropologist, and Nuru will back me up, and any other people who've done fieldwork here will back me up, you come across a shaman, somebody singing, somebody, you know, whatever, and they're producing what might appear at first sight to be nonsense. It sounds like completely nonsensical gibberish, because of course you're coming from a different culture, you've arrived here, and you don't understand this stuff. And if you're a social anthropologist, that is the worst sin. It's never nonsense. You always have to accept that what seems to you like nonsense, under the particular circumstances of this group, with their history, their underlying assumptions, their rituals, it's not nonsense at all, and it could be the most meaningful stuff in the whole society, and you've got to get your head around it and explain it in those terms. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to do that. Noam Chomsky's stuff seems to me complete nonsense, but I'm a social anthropologist, so I can't just dismiss it as like that. I've got to look at the tribe within which this apparent nonsense emerged, and for whom this apparent nonsense was deeply meaningful. So I thought, okay, what do I do? I've got to do a bit of historical research and work out what the tribe was. Well, it was a tribe, actually, and we saw a little clip earlier on of the kind of people we're talking about. These were military scientists, you might call them computer nerds very largely, anyway, software engineers and computer scientists, thrilled with the prospects emerging from Alan Turing's mathematics, the Turing machine and other stuff, which proved that digital computers were possible. And they were working for the military towards the end of the Second World War, and with the beginning of the Cold War, enormous amounts of funding went into this research. I'm going to put on my PowerPoint, I think, at this point, just show. Right. Oh, where's it gone to? Oh. How on earth could that happen? I'm not blaming the CIA, but it does seem... Okay, we better just deal without the PowerPoint till it comes back on. I know this system here, it'll take about half an hour to log on again. Okay, so I was interested in this particular tribe because Chomsky was working on, as I mentioned before, working on, not on missile guidance systems, but this was in the 50s, working on machine translation. So the idea was to work out the design of a machine which would automatically translate from any one language to any other. And the person who'd had the first idea that such a machine might be possible was somebody called Warren Weaver of the Rockefeller Foundation. And among his ideas was a very exciting one. He thought, well, maybe there's an underlying computer code common to all the world's languages. Warren Weaver was the person who set up the MIT machine translation project. And he thought, right, one method of doing machine translation is to kind of just use lots and lots of memory, kind of brute force attack, and try to say they were interested in Russian, essentially, just find out through statistics what the most likely translation of a Russian sentence in some scientific text, what was the most probable corresponding bit of English text. That was one method. But he thought maybe there's a much better method. Maybe what you do is you translate from Russian into the underlying universal language, the underlying digital code common to all the world's languages, if you can discover what that is, and then you translate back up again from that underlying universal code back into English. But what we've got to do is got to find out what this universal code is, specify it, work out its algorithms, work out the mathematics, and install it into our machine. And then with any luck, if it really is this universal code, it will work for any language. You can just translate it from any language into this underlying digital code and then back up to whichever language you want. So it was that absolutely thrilling possibility that they were working on at MIT. Other people were working on more, as I say, more probabilistic, more statistical methods, but of course with very primitive computers, huge computers that would get hot, and mostly the vacuum tubes would explode, and you needed huge amounts of cooling. But they didn't have very much memory, so that brute force method wasn't very realistic in that period. Nowadays, perhaps I should stress, Google Translate, which was actually about a year ago, they suddenly made a huge breakthrough. Google Translate is actually pretty good now, but it works entirely on the probabilistic method. It works on statistics and a vast amount of memory, and the computer just races through all kinds of probabilities and works out what the most probable translation of this Russian sentence is in English. But as I say, MIT they were thinking of something much more exciting, because if you could discover this underlying digital code, the prospect was that you might get accurate translation, not just approximations. You might get a beautiful, accurate translation by going back from Russian or English, whatever, into this underlying code and then back up again. So that was the idea. And okay, now what Chomsky says is quite amazing. He was advised by his friends. Roman Yakovson in particular was a Russian emigre who helped him to try his luck at MIT and get an interview. And so Noam Chomsky got an interview with Jerome Weissner, who was the director of the Research Laboratory of Electronics. This is Noam's own account of the interview. Noam said, "I know you want me to do machine translation, but I'm not interested. It won't work, and I'm not going to help." And on that basis, Jerome Weissner gave me the job. He thought it was a pretty good answer. So I want you to think about that. There's Chomsky kind of there, because he took the job, of course, and for the next quarter century, in one way or another, Jerome Weissner was his boss, and Noam was kind of there and not there. He was doing the work he was paid to do, but he was not doing it. He was there in body, not in mind, working for the military, but not producing anything which they could use.
He says.
I totally accept Chomsky's moral claim. I don't believe that anything he produced was of the slightest use to the US military. And in fact, we know that a few years after he got the job, the director of the research laboratory, the director of the machine translation project within the Research Laboratory of Electronics, was getting more and more impatient and disappointed, and ended up thinking and saying, Noam's stuff is useless. It doesn't work. If you want to do machine translation, you better find a different, basic linguistic theory than Noam's, because we tried it, we've done our best. You don't blame us. We sincerely made a big effort, but it didn't work. And then Chomsky made more and more clear something which he hadn't made very clear before, which was that he never intended it to work. He wasn't interested in machine translation. He was interested in basic linguistic theory. How do you work on a project and not work on it? How do you work in a military lab and oppose the military? So my feeling is that what you do, what Chomsky says, which is that you kind of turn yourself into two people. And if you ask Noam, he'll often say that there are two Noam Chomskys, and he describes his existence in MIT as kind of schizophrenic existence, doing one thing and then doing the opposite, doing one thing and then the opposite. And he makes it very clear, it's not just me saying it, he makes it very clear when left-wingers and anarchists and people often say, no, but what is the connection between the work you're doing for the military and the work you're doing against the military? What is the connection between your linguistics and your political activism. And Noam always very honest. He says, no, there's no significant connection. They're completely different things. You can't join them up. And despite many attempts to connect these two major temptations in his life, he's always said, well, actually they don't meet. Well, I kind of accept that. My point is that there were huge costs, and the costs were essentially to the linguistics. No, just think about it. How do you make sure that your linguistics has got no political implications? You're working for the military, you hate the military, you want to make sure that what you're doing for them doesn't have any political implications, because if they did have political implications, they'd be militaristic implications. The military would use them in the way we were seeing in that film. Well, you can see, can't you, that you have every interest now in extracting from your work all political content. And to do that rigorously and completely, you've got to remove all social significance from language. And you've got to turn language into an object, a natural object, that couldn't possibly be used for any social political purposes. So you've actually got to, in eliminating the social from language, you've got to argue, for example, that it just appeared from nowhere in a mutation, and that language isn't for communication. Because, of course, if it's for communication, then by definition, you're communicating. That's a social interaction. You've got to get rid of all that. So what I'm doing, I'm seeing the extraordinary abstraction of the linguistics as, in a way, admirable. It's like, in order to avoid collusion with the military, Noam had to abstract linguistics away from life. I mean, from evolution, from history, from society, from communication, even from the rest of the brain, actually, and isolate this thing called language in a box of its own, unconnected with anything at all. And June, you mentioned Plato. Well, Noam himself says that. He said he's often said that his philosophy is that of René Descartes, in which case language is an expression of the soul. And of course, he's again said, if you want to argue, okay, how does it have this extraordinary ability to acquire this complex theoretical structure, the grammar of its natal language? He says, well, Plato would have said it's reincarnation. Maybe the child was once an adult linguist, language speaker in some previous life. And Noam actually says, updating Plato, putting Plato into modern language, translating from the term reincarnation to something modern scientists would accept, let's say genetics. So for Noam, genetics is like an updated version of reincarnation. It's the modern way in which we express the idea, the Platonic idea of previous lives and reincarnation. And you can see there's a certain kind of sense in that.
I was actually thinking of the theory of forms. That's much more.
The eternal forms, eternal logical forms, but he says these eternal logical forms are logical and eternal in humans, but only in the human species. Those eternal logical forms don't exist in other primates, and the point at which these eternal logical forms emerged was at this moment of speciation of Homo sapiens, when this cosmic ray shower produced its effects. Now what's happening here? I don't know why do I have to do this Control-Alt-Delete? I've got to log out. Have I really got to log off? To log on. Well, okay. Anthony, I hope you're not recording all this.
Recording everything.
Well, that bit worked. UCL is the most technologically advanced university probably in the world, and it has the most antiquated computer systems. They're so extraordinarily slow. There's a reason for it, of course. When you're the first, you're always the last. When you first develop something, you always have the earliest and therefore the most primitive version. Here we are. What's going on now? Let's see whether this PowerPoint would work, because it will make some of the points a lot better. I've got to try and avoid pressing the wrong button this time. is this PowerPoint. It's whirling around.
It's still
It is whirling around, I believe. Is it whirling around? No, it's not whirling around. Oh, here we are. Coming, it's coming.
Patience.
Patience, everybody, especially me. Right. How are we doing for time? Right, we've got 15 more minutes. It's very hard to be patient, isn't it?
It is when you're called Chris.
Right, okay, now, where's the...
Go to the little thing down at the bottom.
Oh, there it is. Oh, I can see where it is. No, I got it. Yeah, no, that's the one. Yeah, okay, I should have seen that before. Right, okay, now that's my book. Right, now, okay, this is Noam's response to my book. Okay, there was zero military work on campus. You can find the facts from the Pound Commission report on the topic in '69. Nor did the military involve themselves in any way in what was going on. That, of course, included my work. Knight is also deeply confused about the work on linguistics that I and others are doing. He thinks this has something to do with some kind of universal language that he believes the military were interested in. There was no interest of the sort, and if there had been, it would have had nothing at all to do with our studies of universal grammar. It goes on like that. The whole story is a wreck. Or again, this is a quite nice one from the New York Times. The reporter says, how about Chris Knight? He connects your theory of language to Pentagon-funded work you did at MIT during the Cold War. Noam Chomsky. The Pentagon was the means by which the government carried out industrial policy and developed the high-tech economy of the future. MIT was almost entirely funded by the military, including the music department. Does this mean we were doing military work? There was a study in '69, the Pounds Commission. I was a member of it to investigate whether any military or classified work was being done on campus. Answer:
So he investigated
none.
himself.
Now, okay, perhaps I should say a bit about this Pounds Commission. The only way in which he can claim there was no military work done on campus was by citing this one report, the Pounds Commission report from 1969. I know my friends come in and they say, Chris, why do we have to go into these details? I don't know really why. It's just that I sometimes think the truth kind of matters. Anyway, the reason for having this commission was that there was an absolute, almost an insurrection by the students at MIT in the late 60s. And to try to pacify the students, MIT set up this commission. And especially to try to pacify the students, they brought Noam Chomsky onto the commission. And what happened was this. The commission decided, I call it gerrymandering, I don't know what other terms you can think of. You just draw a little boundary around the campus and you say, right, this lab is producing weapons of mass destruction, so we put a little dotted line around it and declare that it's not on the campus. Okay? And this lab, so they went around defining all the military labs not on campus. Now, to be fair to Noam, at the time, he recognized this was a PR ruse, a smokescreen, and he voted against it. And in fact, he argued that far from removing them from the campus, all these military labs should be put right in the middle of the campus and made absolutely visible so that you could see what was going on. And more than that, he said, what you should do, I don't know whether to go to the detailed quotes, it's actually in my book. He says, why don't we just call this, don't call it electronics, call it death technology. Don't call it political science, call it theory of oppression. Why don't we give these things the proper names, put them right in the middle of the campus, and then at least we'll be clear what's actually going on. Anyway, he was outvoted. Hardly surprisingly. And so management decided, as I say, no one was part of this commission, that the Lincoln Lab and Draper Lab and these various other labs were off campus. And I just find it astonishing. Noam uses that management smokescreen against me as the only evidence he's got that there was no military work done on campus. So this, and I am blowing my own trumpet. I think it's a very good book, okay? But I'm just having just a few little blurbs support I've got. The whole story is a wreck. This is Michael Tomasato. Probably Michael Tomasato, for those of you who don't know, he's an evolutionary psychologist. He's probably the only psychologist in the world who's for the last, 30, 40 years been spending these mornings talking to chimpanzees and his afternoons talking to children in order to really narrow down what it is about human cognition which is unique to humans. He's written a whole bunch of books, absolutely fantastic figure. And this is Chomsky from a new perspective, the perspective of social anthropologists. It connects his science with his politics in a novel and convincing way. Knight has dug deeper and made more interconnections than anyone has done before. The result is truly revelatory. Well, thanks, Michael. When I do see you, I will buy you a drink. And this is, in some ways, this matters more to me. Friedrich Neumayer. He's the author of linguistic theory in America, the politics of linguistics. For many years, he's been the main historian documenting the fact that what Chomsky did was inaugurate a scientific revolution on a par with Copernicus and Galileo and Einstein. So when Fritz says, "I can say that this is the best critique of Chomsky from the left that I've ever read," I disagree with Knight quite profoundly on a number of key issues. I mean, he's a Chomskyan. He's lived by Noam Chomsky's work. But then, of course, in every chapter I learned something new, and in fact found myself agreeing with him more and more as the book progressed. Well, I'm very happy about that. And then, honestly, there's no more after this. I'll stop. Luke Steels was one of Chomsky's students in the 80s. I don't know. He's probably produced software for the world's most sophisticated humanoid robots, working for the Sony Corporation. He's an artificial intelligence genius. And what he did was he was unhappy with Noam's work because Noam said language isn't social. So what Luke Steels decided to do was to see whether you could get grammar emerging, complex grammar emerging, by getting these robots to interact, try to communicate, forget the failures and remember the successes, and incrementally build up from the successful instances of communication to produce complex lexicons and complex grammatical structures. And indeed he's proved that that's possible. My argument with him, against him, but with him, and he agrees with me, is that the point about these robots is that they're not selfish. They're not competitive. They just do what they're told. They've got infinite amount of trust. And with infinite trust, it is possible to get language off the ground. But of course, to get infinite trust with primates and no total cooperation with primates is a very complex thing to do. But anyway, obviously I'm very pleased with this. Decoding Chomsky reads like a detective novel. I did try to write it like a detective novel. So many of the arguments I found right on the mark, but I would recommend it just for the pleasure of reading Knight's in great English prose, particularly his talent for understatement. I don't quite know what he means by understatement. I'm glad he thought it was understatement. A truly fantastic work, simply brilliant, couldn't put it down. Okay, so that's why, of course, you've all got to buy the book. But now, okay, these are some pictures. This is I was mentioning earlier, the student uprising, really, at MIT in 69, 68, and then massive confrontation. So this is the war research that all of the students were protesting against, and Noam says, retrospectively now, wasn't happening. He doesn't just say it stopped happening when we defined campus in a different way. He says he just says there was no military research at MIT. So this is November '69. This particular uprising, the MIT students staged mass picket. There was injuries, imprisonments. Okay, and as a cosmetic concession to the student radicals, these labs were no longer officially defined as on campus. And this is Noam's point. This is the Boston Globe in the same period. He's actually saying here that you want to keep. So you had all these students protesting against the military research happening on campus, and Noam Chomsky was saying the opposite. He was saying, no, you're all wrong, you students. You should be keeping it on campus, because if the research is kept on campus, we can keep an eye on it. What you do when you have kept an eye on it, well, he said, what you do is you appeal to their conscience. You talk to the scientists, who of course are getting paid a large amount of money, and you appeal to their conscience to give up all that money and work for the peace movement. but of course the students weren't happy with that. People being killed in Vietnam and places.
It's
And
all rather undermined by the fact that he was being paid large sums of money himself.
he was, but he wasn't doing anything the military could use, June. You have to be honest. Okay. So anyway, so when he says there was no military research done on campus, the point about his own research laboratory of electronics, it was actually right in the middle of the campus. And my friend Mark, who does a lot of research for me, he recently dragged up this Army Research and Development magazine, and there's various passages here, but this one is just the one that matters. Just a few examples of the many RLE research contributions. The RLE means Research Laboratory of Electronics, missile guidance, signal detection, all these things. This is a whole list. I mean, I don't want you to read all that. Sorry, I shouldn't really put that up there. It's a terrible sin with PowerPoint to have huge amounts of text. But this is just a list of all from the Army's point of view, what they were getting out of the lab that Noam Chomsky was working in. Okay, don't want to dwell on that really. So this is, of course, a B-52 bomber. Radar and bomb guidance technology developed at MIT was vital for the B-52 carpet bombing of North Vietnam. Okay, and now we have, this is this guy here with the glasses, MIT economic historian Walt Rostow. He was the chief architect of the B-52 carpet bombing of North Vietnam. And he was actually one of the war criminals singled out by Chomsky in his very influential article he wrote, the Responsibility of Intellectuals, in 1967. So Chomsky considered him a war criminal. He joined the administration, was planning the carpet bombing. When the administration politics changed and it was no longer Democrats, he lost his job, and he wanted a job. He wanted to come back to MIT. The students are outraged. How can this war criminal be allowed to come back to MIT? Do you know what Noam Chomsky did? He appealed to a little group called the Rosa Luxemburg Committee. I think there were about 4 members of it. And he decided that they should have a march to the president's office to demand that the war criminal, they did call him a war criminal, should be allowed his job back, because otherwise it wouldn't be freedom of speech. Freedom of speech means you do allow war criminals to do what they want to do, including crime, but you need to appeal to their conscience. Now that's a missile going slightly awry. It's actually, I think, it's a Trident missile. It's the one that it is the recently launched Trident. I'm not sure that was the actual incident last summer which caused such a fuss. But anyway, the guidance system for the Trident missile that went so badly wrong when it launched from a British submarine off the US coast last summer was designed in the same Boston labs, part of MIT that had previously designed the guidance system for Polaris. The reason I'm mentioning that is because Jerome Weissner was the man who gave Noam Chomsky his job. So when Chomsky said, I'm going to take the job, but I'm not going to do it, and the person then said, interviewing him, that's a very good answer, it was Jerome Weissner. Director of the Research Laboratory of Electronics in the 50s, Dean in the 60s, MIT President in the 70s, Chomsky's boss for 25 years. And this is worth just reading out. This is Jerome Weissner's own proud description of his career. In 1951, I was a member of the group that developed plans for a continental air defense system and then persuaded the Department of Defense to build it. I helped get the United States ballistic missile program established in the face of strong opposition from the civilian and military leaders of the Air Force and Department of Defense. 1954, I helped invent and promote the distant early warning line. And then at the bottom, I was also a proponent of the Polaris missile system, the ballistic missile early warning system, and the satellite reconnaissance systems. So when Chomsky says that I ended up in an electronics lab because there were no vested interests there, and the director, Jerome Weissner, was willing to take a chance on some odd ideas that looked as if they might be intriguing, there's not much doubt really that Weissner himself was a hugely influential military scientist, and that he was certainly hoping that the work that Chomsky and others were doing on machine translation would have military applications, no doubt about it at all. And this is Weissner. You can just see how. Okay, one of the points I'm making really is that yes, I mean Noam Chomsky does keep to his moral principles and his political principles. He does speak truth to power, Now, and I would sort of acknowledge that it is quite easy to speak to truth to power, isn't it? If you're doing so from quite a distance, you can be miles away from power and speak truth to it. I don't think they take much notice, but you can do it. The point I'm making here is that Noam Chomsky, if he was speaking truth to power, was doing so up close and personal. The people he was speaking to were directly part of his milieu, his cultural milieu in the MIT. So he's like one step away from Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and so on. So this is again one of the huge technological projects in Vietnam was to divide North from South Vietnam with a massive wall, this wall would be electronic, and it would be a whole lot of mines and electronic sensors and things. And this guy in this helicopter, he's dropping this. It's full of sensory equipment. The idea is it lands in the ground, is point going into the earth, and what it does, it picks up human sweat odors and urine smells and temperature and heartbeats and stuff, and it manages to distinguish humans from other creatures, so that you can then target your smart weapons at the humans. And this massive line was, high-tech line, was really the beginning of all what we now call smart bombs, smart weapons. And then the other thing is a little bit later, Weissner was replaced as MIT Dean and Provost by his protege John Deutsch. Now this is in some ways even more amazing. John Deutsch was, you remember that a few weeks ago they dropped on Afghanistan the mother of all bombs, the biggest bomb there ever was. It was a version of a fuel-air explosive, the nearest you can get to a nuclear bomb without it being a nuclear bomb. I'm not saying that John Deutsch invented this bomb. It was kind of invented by the Nazis at an earlier period, but he was certainly working on fuel-air explosives as a chemist. Speaking truth to power, how close can he get? And this is Noam Chomsky. John Deutsch has more honest, and so when John Deutsch was appointed head of the CIA, moving from MIT, Noam thought it was great. John Deutsch has more honesty and integrity than anyone I've ever met in academic life or any other life. If somebody's got to be running the CIA, I'm glad it's him. And then in the book, rather ironically, Class Warfare, you could look it up, he says about John Deutsch, we were actually friends and got along fine. Although we disagreed on about as many things as two human beings can disagree about, I liked him. And so this is the point I made at the event a few months ago here in UCL when Noam Chomsky participated. That for 50 years Noam Chomsky has been speaking truth to power not from a safe distance, anyone can do that, but from right up close and personal. The intellectuals responsible for what Chomsky in the 60s rightly described as war crimes in Vietnam were in many cases academics and scientists conducting research as part of his own professional milieu at MIT. And yes, I mean, to my mind, this makes Chomsky's steadfastness in speaking truth to power all the more impressive and remarkable. As I say, the costs are also immense. So just to end with, perhaps, since writing this book, I've come across a PhD thesis by somebody called Janet Nielsen, published in 2010. It's a brilliant piece of historical research. And the thing she points out is that one of the reasons that Noam Chomsky and his colleagues so rapidly dominated and elbowed aside all the other linguists who've been interested in complexities of Hopi linguistic relationships to your mother-in-law, and all the complexities that, previously linguistics was of course part of social anthropology, and people went places and you studied languages out in the field somewhere, and you worked out how very different very often their languages, their basic assumptions, their lexicon, their grammar and so on were from all Western languages. When Chomsky's brand of linguistics came to the fore, all that was swept aside. And the anthropological linguists became marginalized. In some cases lost their jobs, of course. And the hugely influential generativist or transformational paradigm totally swept the board. But what Janet Nielsen points out is that One of the reasons for that wasn't just the fact of the huge prestige of MIT Electronics Lab and the massive amount of military funding, which for the first time went into linguistics. I mean, of course, the people who were studying the Hopi didn't get an ounce of military funding, various Aboriginal languages or hunter-gatherer languages. Why would the military be funding you for working out their songs, their poetry, their metaphors and so on? But this new form of linguistics got huge funding. But Nielsen goes further. She says, the key thing which meant that Chomsky could elbow aside all the opposition was that they never submitted their writings, their proposals, to peer review. They're never published in peer-reviewed journals. And the reason was, the reason they could get away with that is because this was a technological lab. They'd had a history of producing gadgets. And if you're producing gadgets, you don't send your paper to a peer-reviewed journal.
Because it's secret.
And of course, you're quite right. In addition to that, you had the fact that the tradition was you're doing top secret classified work, which means, of course, you don't publish. So what happened was that the Chomsky and their supporters, when they cited people, they cited either themselves in a previous note to themselves, or they cited a remark made in a previous conversation, or they cited an unpublished manuscript or something which had been mimeographed as authority for what they were saying. And what happened was that the sort of old school linguists who were furious at all this thing happening, they found that they couldn't gain access to any of the sources which would enable them to evaluate MIT linguistics, because these sources were just unavailable, inaccessible. So what happened was they ended up being a bit like me. They just got bad-tempered and they just withdrew from the scene. They just said, well, I'm not playing this for a game of soldiers, I'm going somewhere else, and it just left the field open to Chomsky and his followers with enormous amount of, and don't forget, when you get a huge amount of money from the military, it isn't just the money, by the way, it's an enormous amount of prestige. And there was an added twist to it, because people were thinking, well, but we all know that Noam Chomsky is anti-militarist. He may even be an anarchist, some kind of revolutionary. Well, the military wouldn't be funding an anarchist revolutionary unless the linguistics was really good. It has to be really good, doesn't it? Because the military aren't going to throw their money around. So you can see how enormous amount of prestige surrounded this new model of linguistics. And just to end, why does it all matter? Well, what it did is that I'm arguing that initial interview where Chomsky was there in body but not in spirit, it separated the body from the spirit. It separated mind from body in a profound way. It separated theory from practice in a profound way. In linguistics, it turned out to be what Noam described as a distinction between performance and competence. He says that, for example, a child can know language, like say English. He can know everything there is to know about English in principle without having once spoken or heard a word of English. That's his argument, because it just needs to set certain parameters in its head, having heard maybe a couple of words to know that at least it's not Russian or Japanese, but actually all the complexities of the grammar already packed into this language organ. So performance is then set aside. So actually what people do, how they really speak, is all set aside as of no interest, because it's all social and therefore complicated, and therefore you can't do science in it. But what it ended up doing was producing a completely abstract physics envy, really, like as if language is a form of physics, a form of mathematics or mathematical physics. So what you have, in order to enable this kind of dual act to continue, you had to get rid of all the social aspects from language, but equally on the other side, having removed from your science everything social about it, and Chomsky is very emphatic about there's no such thing as social science, so you have a form of science which is purely natural science. On the other side of the equation, like the other Chomsky, to avoid any kind of mutual interference, has to remove all science from the politics. And although I like the politics, what I do notice is there's no science in it. There's never in anything Chomsky, and he's, in many ways I understand this, he says you don't have to be a genius, you don't need all kinds of complex theories to know that it's wrong, to intentionally or not care about the civilians you're killing. You don't need a huge amount of theoretical complexity to know that it doesn't make a lot of sense to tell other countries not to have nuclear weapons when you're stockpiling the nuclear weapons yourself. He says this is all common sense. That's fair enough, but on the other hand, to have a form of activism which is kind of mindless in the sense that, you know, I've always thought that the one thing humans have got still, and I say from our hunter-gatherer past, the one thing we've got which makes us really, really remarkable species is that we check each other up. You know, do you see what I see? Every time if I just think of something myself, it's egocentric. What's special about humans is that we don't do that. We check whether others see things the same way as we do. And the more of those others there are, maybe the more objective our knowledge is. Well, science is like that. It's kind of the only international language we've got. I don't have this, you know, abstract, dehumanized vision of science that I think Chomsky and other people have, but I do think that it's very important to have a way of communicating with each other across the world which is rational, which means not egocentrical. But if you have activism which is divorced from that, it's at the expense of the activism. Just as if you have a form of science or linguistics which is completely divorced from what it means to be human, and from our emotions and passions, I think again that's hugely damaging. So this huge split between theory and practice, all of that came out of this event, this massive intellectual event which Chomsky spearheaded in the 50s and early 60s, known as the cognitive revolution. And almost the definition, in my view, of the cognitive revolution is separating the head from the body. Everything is supposed to happen in the mind, the body doesn't matter too much. You certainly can't be scientific about anything that people do in practice, and you separate theory and practice to such an extent that you end up with the schisms that we're all suffering from today. I do think that the mess we're in today across the world is very largely a product of the way in which theory and practice, science and passion, you know, have been split. And we're all afflicted by that same split, which was like epitomized in that little interview that Chomsky gave, I think, in that first time when he said, "I'm going to work for you, but I'm not going to work for you." You know. Okay, let's have a tea break, quick tea break.